webinar on dynamic performance management. My name is Octavius Black. I'm CEO of MindGym, and I'm joined by Sebastian Bailey, President of MindGym Inc. When it comes to performance reviews, we've looked at them and been part of them for a good dozen years now, and we come to the view that the annual review to recruiters is a bit like Christmas is to divorce lawyers, the storm that comes before the call. And yet it shouldn't be like this. It should be that performance conversations are all about me, and this is a chance to get excited and motivated rather than depressed and wanting to walk out the door. And so, whereas we perhaps too often rely on the annual review to manage performance, that's a bit like focusing on our anniversary in order to nourish our marriage. That if we just focus on that event, we're probably going to miss out quite somewhat. And yet, when we get performance management right, it delivers a direct and immediate boost to productivity, customer service, keeping talent, and even stock performance. It doesn't actually have to cost a penny either. So what we want to talk a little bit more about this morning is how to deliver more with less forever. I'll pass over to Seb.
Thank you, Octavius. So this is what we're going to look at over our time together. The first part is, what is the business case for dynamic performance management? And there is some very good evidence that when done well, performance management leads to significant financial and operational and people performance in organizations. So we're just going to briefly explore that. But in many cases, the evidence is a bit mixed. So that there are stories of great success, but there are also stories of failure. And so we're going to have a look at why is it that performance management fails? Why doesn't it provide the return that we would all hope? And then given that, if you want to get it right, what do we need to do? So we're going to explore the 5 ingredients of dynamic performance management, the 5 things that, if done well, you seem to get performance management that delivers the results versus the performance management that just seems to be a bit of a damp squib. And then what we do is we introduce a new performance management cycle. So as well as the right ingredients, you need the right cadence. And we're going to introduce the cadence that we think works effectively. And finally, if you have done all of these things, what sorts of impacts can you get, and where have we demonstrated these impacts in other organizations? So without further ado, on to the business case. Over back to Octavius.
Thank you, Seb. It seems to us that employee engagement is a bit like global warming. There have been lots of evangelists for a long period of time, but suddenly now the level of research and evidence to support those claims is becoming stronger and stronger. And there are 2 examples I want to mention briefly before I move on to what is on this slide in front of you. The first is from Wharton Business School. What they've done there is they've examined over a period of 6 years the performance of people doing largely clerical with slight IT-related elements. So, for example, the checkout at a supermarket or dealing with airline tickets at an airport. And what they looked at is the difference between swapping a poor manager with a good one. Now, this is a big study. There are 6 million data points, so they can pull out what the impact is. And what they've found is over the course of these 6 years, the productivity gain of swapping a poor manager for a good one is 12%. Now, adding another member to the team adds only 11% extra in output. So this is a significant direct operational productivity gain. Now, some might argue, well, that's fine. It's a clerical job. It's repetitive. A good manager will make a difference there. But what about in know-how, in thought-related roles? Well, here Stanford comes into play, and what they've done is look at a knowledge-based industry, which is video games. Now, these is a really good industry, partly because it's growing, there's lots of data, but also because each new video game, not only do people track the revenue, but they also have listed on them the name of the chief innovator, called the designer or director, and the chief project manager, called the producer. The names are borrowed from Hollywood to apply to this industry where it had previously been thought that innovation, coming up with a concept, the creative juices that sit behind it, marked out the successful games from the less successful ones. Well, indeed, a great director does make a difference. The Stanford study shows that the increase in sales of a good director versus a poor one was 7%. Not massive, but still certainly worth having. More interestingly, perhaps, is the impact that a great producer has. Swapping out a poor producer for an excellent one gave it an increase of almost 23% in sales. And therefore, the 2 added together, good managers in charge of a new video game, gave you a 30% uplift in terms of the impact that you'd have. Now, this is supported by the chart you see on the slide from Jack Fitz-Enns, one of the great thinkers and researchers in the area of human resource management. And here he looks at the difference between high-performing companies and weaker-performing companies based on stock price over a period of time linked to certain elements of performance management. So if you look, for example, at the second pair of columns, you will see here that there's a 40 times greater probability that a manager has goals aligned to the company's strategy in a stronger performing business from a weaker one. And there's far more research and studies that we can share and that you will find in our report and other places that show that there's a very strong financial gain from getting this stuff right. So if there's such a great gain, why aren't more people doing that? And I'll pass back to Seb.
And that's where we look at why does performance management fail? So very frequently we come across organizations that have started to implement or execute or try and create momentum around developing a performance culture, but they just don't seem to be getting the sorts of gains that Octavius has talked about. And through our literature review and through interviewing a good number of organizations, this is some of the reasons that we discovered. The first one is that there is this murky link between strategy, goals, feedback, reward, development, and progression. And so what people feel is, as an individual employee, what I feel is that what I'm doing, A, I'm not massively clear about, but B, I don't really understand how what I do contributes to the broader output of the organization or even of my team. And not only that, but they have troubles with what some organizations call vertical alignment, whether or not an individual's goals sort of cascade into the organization's goals, and also horizontal alignment, so that you ensure that an individual's goals in one functional department actually work with and collaborate with the goals in alternative departments, because otherwise you end up with silo mentality and you end up with lots of extra work being done. A lot of wasted time. So this first big issue really is about the murky link between strategy, goals, and individuals' delivery. The second is that everyone scores the same. And we were with one organization, I was with one CEO a year or so ago, and he said, I don't understand why the business as a whole seems to be seriously underperforming in the marketplace. And yet when I look at the performance management system, I'm told that everybody is very, very good. How can that be? And so what we end up with is, and the reason for that, is that as people do the scores, as people run the performance management or the annual reviews, you end up with people sort of aggregating around a single score. So everybody ends up scoring very good as opposed to a proper differentiation. The next, which we see very commonly, is that reluctant managers focus on process rather than actually on the conversation itself. Very frequently what you have is individual contributors who end up being very good at their job. They're good at sales or customer service. And what happens is they're promoted into a management position. And then when they're promoted into that management position, they continue to focus on the things that made them great individual contributors, which tends to be actually focusing on process, focusing on workflow, focusing on the tasks at hand. And so what happens is they treat performance management as another task to check off the list, another set of boxes to tick, another series of forms to complete, as opposed to getting into deep, high-quality conversations about the individual and about the individual's performance. The next challenge we face is that individuals feel uninspired about their future. And this is partly because they don't see the link between their goals and the business's strategy, but also partly because they don't see a career path or how they can start to grow and develop. In one organization that we've been working with recently, we've discovered that actually the organization is very good at dealing with their high potentials, their high performers, the cream of the crop, the top talent. But the rest of the organization, anybody who's not in that top 3 or 4%, really don't feel nurtured. And many people feel quite stuck in their roles, particularly those people who've been there for a while, the mid-career prisoners. And so what happens is that you don't have the right conversations, they continue to feel disengaged, and then their productivity and their performance starts to drop off. So this connection between their future and their performance is an important link that frequently is missed. And the final one is that responsibility is placed either on HR or alternatively with line managers. So the leadership say to the HR function, can you try and fix our performance management? And then the HR function sort of says to line managers, can you please take responsibility for performance management? And in the desire for, a very understandable desire for control and for accountability, what you actually end up with is ignoring that the individual needs to be encouraged to take responsibility. And by individual, we don't mean individual contributor. We actually mean every individual within the organization, so that the individual sees themselves as the most important performance manager they have and actually takes responsibility for their goals and for seeking feedback and thinking about what great really looks like. So in those organizations that are overrepresented with poor performance management practices, it's these 5 reasons that we most frequently see them fail. So how do you turn that around? What's the equivalent? What are the magic ingredients? And that's what we're going to share with you now. And the first magic ingredient is stretching goals with fortnightly feedback. And I'd like to share this experiment that was done here that I think illustrates this really very neatly. And what happened was the researchers wanted to try and create a performance improvement, in particular behaviors that were related to sustainability. And the interesting thing about the sustainability as a behavior is it's a whole series of small things rather than one big thing that you actually have to take responsibility for. And what they were measuring was the amount of reduction in waste products and the amount of positive behaviors that were related back to sustainability. And what they did was they set 4 conditions with this population. The first condition they set was, we want to give you a 20% goal as an increase. So we want you to improve your performance by 20%, and we will provide you with very frequent feedback. The next condition, the next population, just had a 2% goal. So really quite an easy goal, but they also got very frequent feedback. The next group had a 20% goal, but had no feedback they had very little feedback. So they had a stretching goal. They were sort of aware of their performance, but it wasn't as frequent, it wasn't as regular as with a frequent condition. And finally, it was a 2% goal with little or no feedback, so an easy goal without much feedback. And then this is what happened in terms of people's performance. The 20% goal, so where they had a really stretching target and they get lots of frequent feedback, they actually saw a 15% improvement. So they didn't quite hit the stretching goal, but their performance was really very significant when related to the group who had the easy goal and had frequent feedback. So the frequent feedback seems to give you that shift, but the easy goal meant that as soon as people surpassed it, the frequency of feedback meant they pushed themselves a little bit more, but it was nowhere near as effective as actually a stretching goal that really made people think about how they could overperform. Now, what happened with the 20% goal with no feedback was, again, people pushed themselves a little bit, but the lack of feedback, the lack of the thing that really pushed them on, again meant that the performance was lower than that they would desire. And finally, the 2% goal with no feedback, ultimately the performance was about the same. That's almost a sort of sampling error in the fact that there was no significant difference. Now, the interesting question here is what's happening in your organization. You know, are you an organization that has stretching goals and frequent feedback, or are you an organization that has fairly straightforward goals with frequent feedback, stretching goals without much feedback, or fairly straightforward goals without a great deal of feedback? And it's actually this category that we see a lot of the challenges in organizations coming from. Goals are just a little bit straightforward, and the frequency of feedback is really weak. And unsurprisingly, that means that performance management systems just don't yield the benefit that people would ideally like. So to look at our next magic ingredient, I'm going to hand back to Octavius now.
I just want to quickly respond to a question that's come up about the previous studies about how they compare good and bad managers. And what they simply did was look at the change a manager made on performance, because people were doing the same tasks and over the same period of time, and given enough data, you could simply see the impact that a good or a bad manager was having, because everything else was remaining equal. What you'll see from this other data that we're providing with you today and further data is what are the traits of great managers, and there's a separate piece on the 7 talents that make for high-performing managers, managers that get better results, and we're touching on some of those today. So to move on now to the challenge of number 2, which is around consistent differentiation. Seb talked about one chief executive everyone was scoring brilliantly. Paul Polman, when he arrived at Unilever, said everyone's scoring average. And he said, no wonder this is an average organization. Now, Seb's example is another one with a leniency bias and everyone scores at a high level. But where this is a great concentration around a particular level, what happens is something called social loafing. And social loafing takes place when one person starts to ease off their work and nothing seems to happen. And no one seems to notice until one of their colleagues notices, and they start to ease off a little bit too and see if they can get away with slacking a bit, and nothing happens. And then slowly, one by one, everyone else starts to ease off a little bit of their effort. And then the first person goes, my gosh, I'm working as hard as everybody else, and nothing seems to have happened, so I'll ease off a bit as well. And you get a vicious cycle of people slowly easing off. If you there's an experiment with a tug of war, and the first two people pulling at either end of the rope pull so hard, when someone else comes on, then they pull a little less hard. And there are other experiments that show the power of social loafing when we don't mark out differential performance. So the place we want to get to is what we call broadly a normal distribution. It doesn't be a specific normal distribution. And again, the research on whether we should have forced distribution or not is quite clear. A strictly forced distribution where you have a certain percentage of people in each decile or quartile or whatever it happens to be has a negative impact on performance, with the one exception of a situation where there has been no performance management at all, in which case it shakes things up so much that it can be useful as a kind of big transformational step, but it's not something to continue with. What has the best impact is something called guided differentiation, guided distribution, where there's a sense of roughly where the curve should look like, but we don't argue in the detail around one person or two people, one side or the other of the boundary. And therefore that creates a sense of fairness. Now we create that fairness by having conversations, and we'll talk a bit more about that in a moment. But that's about the different managers having a chance to talk to each other about what does a 3 or a 4 or an excellent or a very good performance look like, and reaching a shared view. So there becomes a shared understanding of what we mean, and that therefore my performance is based not on what my particular manager thinks, but what the organization thinks, or the collective of managers. Which brings to the second point on consistent differentiation, which is what kind of manager do I like? And we thought we would do a little poll here. So in a moment I'm going to ask us to put up a poll to say who would you rather be managed by? And the choice is Simon, who is firm, clear, doesn't hold back from giving harsh messages, has a strong view, and isn't terribly open to nurturing people who may feel a little hurt by things. On the other end, there's Nicole. She is a tremendously supportive, nurturing, kind, sweet person, and will not say anything that will upset you too much. So we thought we'd open the poll now. We've got 20 seconds. Please vote. Which manager would you rather have, Simon or Nicole? The voting is taking place as we speak. It's not quite X Factor with everyone dialing in and pressing numbers and the sheer volume of votes, but it's certainly a hint in that direction, and we'll find out in just a moment who is the most preferred manager. And I think the poll has now ended, and I probably need to press something clever in order to see the results. It's actually just calculating. So many people have voted. It is like X Factor, with thousands of people from across the world polling away. Well, certainly over 100 at least. And we'll have those results in just a moment, I think. Do we have results here? I'm sure they don't have this next. The results are in. Nicole comes in at 30% would rather have Nicole, and 70% would rather have Simon. And actually, whenever we've done this study, it's pretty much the same results. Simon scores twice as highly as Nicole. And the thing is, we don't want someone who's, by and large, nice and nurturing. We want someone who's fair and clear. And therefore, there's a sense of helping managers see, as Seb talked about earlier, one of the risks is that managers focus on process and systems rather than conversations. But actually, what people want is people willing to have straight and courageous conversations. Those straight and courageous conversations are great, provided they're based on my performance, not on your mood. Which comes to the third part of consistent differentiation, and that's called yesterday's hangover. The idea that the way I review your performance will depend on whether I've got a hangover or had a tough meeting. And this study is interesting because it shows the performance of the profitability of partners in a large professional services firm. And the single factor that has most difference between the more profitable and the less profitable is not how smart they are, their cognitive abilities, but their ability to regulate their emotions. Their ability to come to each situation emotionally fresh rather than dragging the moods from where they've come before. So number one, as Seb talked about, was stretching goals and frequent feedback. Number 2 of the 5 factors is consistent differentiation, but it comes in many different forms. And I'm now going to pass back to Seb.
Thank you very much. So let's move on to this third one, which is what we've called commercial coaching. And what we saw both in the literature and in the survey and the interview that we conducted was that in many respects, what used to happen with managers was that they would adopt a very sort of directive tell style of making things happen. So they would go in and in one retail organization we worked with, the managers were tasked with improving the quality of customer service and sales, and they would very simply tell the people in the branch or tell the branch managers, if they were an area manager, what to do. What then happened was that coaching programs kicked in, a more facilitative style, a more consensus-driven style of leadership was encouraged, and the pendulum swung over to much more of an ask approach to coaching. So the predominant focus was on the past and what can be learned. So how did that go? What do you think happened? What worked? What didn't? What might you do? What would you have done differently? And so almost sort of facilitating out the answers from the individual, which has some benefit. The issue was that it took quite a long time, and often a reluctant or less competent manager would hide behind a facilitative approach as opposed to fronting up and actually think about how they would get the result faster. So what we saw was, and what we felt was needed, and what we have started to work on, was actually how you can get this commercial coaching to start to take place, where the role of the manager is as much about education as it is about direction or facilitation. And so what happens is, and this is based actually on brief therapy, on solutions-focused coaching, solutions-focused counseling, and so it can be shorter, more solutions-oriented, and I hope to get to the outcome faster through a much more educative approach. So they spend more time discussing what the future looks like. The relationship becomes really key in terms of it feeling more like an apprenticeship and a master, and also dialogue takes place where there are strong views or where there's a difference, so the individual feels attended to and listened to, as opposed to over-trodden, which can happen in the tell approach, and actually just a little bit sure of which way the wind is blowing in the facilitative or ask approach. So this commercial coaching piece can lead to really quite faster, more rapid, more effective, business-oriented coaching. And so with that, we're going to move on to the next ingredient, which Octavius is going to take on now.
Thank you, Seb. And this is around job crafting and helping people get from a stage, and this particularly applies to top talent, to high performers, where they feel stuck, they feel disengaged, and either they leave or they subtly sabotage, or the social loafing gets to extreme levels. And what happens here is about altering the job to suit someone's motivations and strengths. So instead of trying to change the shape of the peg, it's trying to change the shape of the hole. And good managers will be really strong at spotting where the proclivities and enthusiasms of their people are, and then reshaping the role, the way the team's structured. So we worked with a contact center where the local manager had changed the induction process so that even the new arrival who wasn't normally allowed to do induction, because she was so welcoming, caring and nurturing, the manager reshaped the induction process so that the new arrival could do a lot of the initial bit about getting someone to feel warm and find their legs and know where to get the sandwiches and find the teapot and all those other good things. So this is an anathema to many HR people who want to have clear job roles and clear job specs. Actually, the clever managers are shaping the role as they go. So far, we've talked about 4 areas, and they're all about the manager. A lot for the managers to do, and again, a lot for HR specialists to do in order to support managers to help them to do that. But the last piece of the 5 that makes most difference is about employees taking responsibility. We have a slightly provocative internal marketing materials here, which where's your career heading? And the theme of this is to say take responsibility for it, because the organization will not give you a career or a future, nor will your manager, though they can both help. But what you can do is take responsibility yourself. And again, we ran a pilot with 120 people going through a 2-hour session called Pathfinder. And what that did was help people work out how much they'd flourish in their future if they left things as they were, say a 7 out of 10, and what they could do to turn that 7 into a 9 or a 10 out of 10 in 2 years' time. And they left that session feeling much more in control, much more aware of how they could affect the outcome, how they could get useful feedback and coaching, and how they could develop. And as a result, when we went back to measure 6 months later, they felt far more committed to the organization and far more aware of what career opportunities they could shape for themselves there. So these are the 5 areas where we get most value. They're not the only things that matter, but where we can get most value in terms of the conversations and the mindsets that will drive high performance. Now, people say, what does a good system look like that needs to sit underneath it? And we thought we'd briefly touch on this. Many of you will have systems that look like this, or fancier or clever or so forth. There are just a couple of points I wanted to pick out. The first is iterating in the review cycle. This is the thing I mentioned earlier under the consistent differentiation. This is where managers get together and have one of the most important conversations about different levels of performance of people in their team, how they see it, how they rate it, and how they regard it, and how they learn from each other in order, therefore, to have a fair and more equitable view. Now, at a more advanced level, that also happens at the goals cycle. There's an iterating conversation. Are we setting suitably stretching goals? Now, in the regular day-to-day cycle, at a minimum, we'd hope to have an annual review. We certainly hope in a good practice to have at least a mid-year catch-up and maybe even the quarterly reviews. But as Seb talked about at the beginning, the greatest impact is actually fortnightly one-to-ones. Now, these don't need to be formal meetings, they don't need to be sit-downs, they don't even need to be diarised. They could be on the phone, they could be travelling on a train together, they could be a whole range of places. But the thing that matters is the individual gets a chance to talk about and learn about their performance, how they're doing against their goals, and what they could do differently in order to progress. And it's these regular conversations, these regular touch points, if you like, the date night of the performance management cycle, that leads to people feeling aware, involved, and connected about how they're doing and how they can grow. So this is the 5 things that matter. And you've seen the business impact, and this is the process that will, at its best, support those kind of conversations. What is it that we can do, all of us, excuse me, to help build those skills and build those capabilities? And to talk a little bit more about that, I'm going to pass back to Seb.
Thank you. So let's look at a typical program. What we have over here is we have the individual, the learner, the participant, typically the manager, and the experience that they may very well have. And the first aspect of this that they need to do, you need to engage the individuals. Mind you, we talk about 3 stages of learning and of transfer, and that's actually engaging people, creating participation, and then creating activation of their prior learning. So the first stage is this really crucial moment around engagement, and it's this internal marketing that allows you also to tell the organizational story about the performance culture. So how can you start to align the goals? How can we shift the focus of performance management away from filling in forms and checking boxes to one of dialogue or one of stretching goals? So in one organization, we focus very specifically on changing the types of goals so they'd be more stretching. In another organization, it was all about conversations and strength of those key touch point, career-forming conversations that they wanted to build the program around. The other thing the internal marketing gives you an opportunity to do is express what's in it for the individuals. And very often, performance management programs come out of poor results and engagement survey. So one project that we're working on at the moment, the individuals don't feel they're getting that. The individuals actually feel that there is a series of very high performers who are being rewarded, but pretty much everyone else in the organization is ignored. And so you're able to hone and craft the messages to really start to reinforce that performance culture. What we then have is a diagnostic. So one of the greatest correlates of transfer is perceived relevance and emotional resonance. 2 key factors. And a diagnostic, a questionnaire that you could do 360, it could just be self-report, that gives you a sense of how am I doing in terms of my performance management skills, either as an individual or as a manager or as a leader, really gives that very strong sense of what I need to do differently to start to make this work. And then what happens is you have a series of distributed sessions that focus on different issues. So first of all, over here, we have a performance management why bother session and courageous conversations. So this is almost sort of launches the sense of the importance of performance management and a key part of that, which is good quality dialogue. And then based upon the cadence of the performance management year, you're able to offer experiences to people just in time so that they improve the quality of their skills. So for example, in the second month, we have goal setting, then we have a month on the quality of feedback, then there's a month on performance coaching, and then there's a month on how you can start to shape roles and then deal with underperformers and then deal with high performers and so on. So actually what this becomes is a distributed program that's built into the fabric of the business as opposed to a one-shot to deal with quite a small issue. And then what we have also are these wavy lines in between the sessions. We call them missions. And so at the end of an experience, we give people a mission. So, okay, go and actually coach now one of your underperformers, or go and have a conversation with one of your team members where their goals and make their goals more stretching, but do it in a way that excites them rather than demotivates them, or they feel like the goalposts are shifting on them. And what we can do is actually design these intercession tasks, design these missions in such a way that they become totally relevant to the organization, that they are built into the individual's workflow, but also what they do is they drive transfer, because then people feel that they're going to, when they regroup, how you got on was revisited, and you can discover where people were successful and you discover where people didn't manage, and that's just as interesting to discuss and to create transfer and momentum with. So where we've done and we've done these sorts of programs with New York Life and Marks and Spencer and Fujitsu, a number of investment banks, Johnson & Johnson. What have the outcomes been? Has it worked? Well, here is one story that we did with a retail organization, and they were actually a top performer in terms of customer experience anyway, but part of the brief was to improve and to keep pressing on the quality of customer experience. So we saw a 4% increase in customer experience scores, and we actually saw a 29% increase in their ability to hit revenue targets. It wasn't revenue specifically, because they were very conscious about wanting to make sure they got their portfolio mix in retail sales correct. So it was actually their ability to hit revenue targets. We saw a 29% increase there. And we also saw increases in engagement and in manager-rated self-performance improvements. So the impact of this was really very, very significant based upon the ingredients that we've just discussed. And with that, to close, I'm going to hand back to Octavius.
And so while you're handing back to me, there's one question that's come up quite a lot in the chat, which is the study that shows the negative impact of a fixed distribution curve? Do you recall it from mind?
Yes, I can't give you the exact reference, but it was what they actually did was that they ran a model that looked at what would happen to forced versus guided distribution over 3 years. And what they saw was that there were significant gains in year 1, and then in year 2 and year 3, actually it started to have a really quite a negative impact, because you started cutting into meat and bone as opposed to removing fat. And so the impact broadly, exactly as Octavius said, is negative in years 2 and 3, but can be positive in year 1 if there hasn't been a previous performance management system to actually ensure that poor performers are turned around and great performers are rewarded. Now, what we can also do is I think they call it the show notes and podcasts, but we can actually include that link in the email that we send through. It's also referenced in the white paper.
Great. Thanks very much for all of you for coming to join that. We've had 150 people on this webinar. We're very delighted you've manned the time to join us. We will be sending you an email where there is a free link to download a free white paper and also take a free online diagnostic to see how close your organization, your team, or your division is to delivering on the dynamic performance management 5 key criteria. We will be running future webinars in the future. Please give us your feedback now. Let us know what you liked that we should repeat, what we should do differently to make them stronger, and hopefully we'll see you again next time. Thank you very much, and wishing you all a very pleasant day. Bye.
Bye-bye.